Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Sunday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather with us tonight. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with the very latest weather information for your community in Alaska by heading to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov if that's the link you like to use. They'll go to the same place. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can find weather information in between the Alaska Weather shows on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. And you'll find the entire broadcast that you're watching right now on our broadcast partners website, alaskapublic.org, or on youtube.com. Simply search for AKWX TV. The weather headlines for tonight: flash flood watches are posted for the Alaska Range on the north side and into the upper Kuskokwim Valley through Monday morning. Another round of rain. Some of those pockets of rain could be heavy and maybe total more than an inch in some isolated areas. It could bring up the rivers once again and very quickly. Thus the flash flood watch. We'll have more on that in just a moment. Unsettled weather is expected through the remainder of the next 5, 6, and even 7 days. The interior and Gulf of Alaska most of the week will have waves of showers and wind blowing through. Nothing too strong, but certainly a wet and unsettled period for us in the next 6 to 7 days. And late week changes still coming for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island. We talked briefly about that tonight. We'll be watching for that to kind of develop as we get into late Wednesday, Thursday, and into Friday. Here's the flood watches that we were talking about just a moment ago, all the way from the upper Kuskokwim Valley, stretching around the Alaska Range, including Denali National Park, the eastern part of the interior in the upper Tanana Valley, and flood advisories for the middle Tanana Valley, including the Fairbanks region. Now, with recent rains kind of slacking off a little bit in the last day or so, we're seeing a return to a wet and stormy pattern. A lot of thunderstorm activity upriver this afternoon. You've probably seen some of the clouds and probably heard some of the thunder if you're a little bit farther west, say in Tanana. A lot of that cloud cover with rainfall is moving westward, and with the swollen creeks and streams as of recent days, probably seeing a little bit of a decline in that river level, but any additional rainfall in those areas on top of those soggy soils could bring those levels up pretty quickly. So if you're watching from the Denali National Park area or around Healy, the upper Kuskokwim Valley around McGrath, or perhaps doing some traveling into the eastern Alaska Range or in the upper Tanana Valley, you want to keep an eye on those river levels and remember the safety tip: turn around, don't drown. If you see water over a roadway, don't cross it. Look and make sure that it's not washing out the road underneath, and sometimes that's very hard to tell. Just because you have a monster truck doesn't mean it's going to float, and the only vehicles that I am aware of with 4 wheels that do float are the ones called ducks, and you probably don't have one of those, so be extra careful out there. A little bit less intense at the moment is the Matanuska River. Rising after heat and rain the last week. We had about 2 to 3/10 of an inch of precipitation around the Palmer to Wasilla area. Some of that could have been a little bit heavier across the higher terrain there in the Talkeetnas. But you're looking at the Matanuska River gauge at the Old Glen Highway, and here's the hydrograph as you see across just below the action stage for most of that graph. Now, over the next couple days, it's going to go up and down a little bit, but we expect that with areas of heavier rainfall upstream, some of these smaller streams and creeks will probably come up and down. And with recent heat, we're still seeing some melt off the glacier there. Now, if we get the heat back, that'll give us some additional concerns. But as you'll notice, it's still moving into the action stage as we get into late tomorrow, and then decreasing as we head into Monday afternoon, and then going back up again. We think the peak will be around 9.11 feet. You can see all of this information you like by going to weather.gov/Alaska or aprfc.arh.noaa.gov for the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, who supplied us with this forecast here. Here's a look at the Bering Sea satellite picture now. The unsettled weather is coming across the Pacific. You can see in the main core of the jet stream working these waves across the central and northern Pacific here. One area of low pressure south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, clearly seen there. And now, as we were talking about yesterday, the typhoon that's working its way northward out of the central Pacific, is just coming in view here, and it looks like this is going to be a beast as it moves up toward Japan. We'll have to see what kind of interactions that plays with Alaska in the next 6 to 7 days, but if it is moving north and east, we may see an opportunity to latch on to some of that moisture there. So time will tell there. That's way far out to see anything for sure just yet. Out across western Alaska, a lot of low cloud cover, a lot of that stretching into the Bering. We'll see that a little bit more here on the visible satellite picture. Across southeast, things seem to be drying up a little bit more today. You can see several other impulses rotating around this overall area of low pressure in the upper atmosphere. It's taking low pressure systems, digging them down across the Pacific, and then winding them back up across the Pacific Northwest and Southeast, bringing some of that moisture into South Central. But really what's doing the trick for you in the interior is the heat and the moisture moving in from east to west. And here's another batch of that working its way into the upper Tanana Valley and the Alaska Range here. So again, if you're watching around Denali National Park or around Northway up toward Tok, and maybe out toward Dawson, this is where that moisture is coming from. And again, those flash flood watches could be impacting your area here as we head into Monday night and perhaps beyond. We'll just have to wait and see. A visible satellite picture also shows a lot of sunshine breaking through today for areas north of the Alaska Range. That did include parts of Arctic Village out around Fairbanks and west toward Tanana. Beautiful day it looked like, with plenty of sunshine and plenty of heat, with high temperatures once again in the upper 70s and lower 80s. It looked like Tanana and probably Ruby, I think, made it up to 84 degrees today. Hottest temperatures that we saw on our charts anyway, and maybe your temperature was just a little bit warmer. Around South Central, high pressure was trying to work its way into Prince William Sound. It kept the winds down a little bit today, but it wasn't doing the trick of keeping the clouds out. Rainfall blossomed out across the Copper River Basin, worked its way westward all day long. We saw some breaks in the southern part of the Kenai Peninsula as we went on through the afternoon. But it's been kind of a cooler day compared to temperatures that were in the 70s and 80s in the southern third of the state yesterday. Well, it looks like that focus for heat has shifted northward now. Showers and storms were blossoming across the central and western Yukon and moving westward into the interior. Southeast was catching a little bit of a break as a wave of low pressure worked its way northward. Showers were redeveloping to the south, though. We'll see if some of that works its way northward tonight. And out across the west, plenty of low clouds and very stable air. Very light winds, it looks like, with high pressure around 1,018 millibars. And that's going to hover out across the west through tonight. Pockets of rainfall, some of that a little more showery as you head out into the Gulf there, into the ridge of high pressure here. Southeast looking at a few showers grazing the southern part of the Panhandle. Looks like most areas are going to be a lot drier than they were for the last 24 hours. And around South Central and points northward up around the Richardson Highway, pockets of light to moderate rainfall. Areas of showers and storms expected as well. A few showers maybe across Arctic Village and points east. Out across the west, a few showers from time to time under that relatively stable air mass, but there could be some light shower activity there and around the chain. The Alaska Peninsula and parts of Kodiak Island looking at a little bit more of a light rainfall there. Same goes for the YK. And as we head into tomorrow, you'll notice that the overall pattern continues to just sit in kind of an unstable flow. High pressure sitting across the eastern part of southeast will keep the flow locked in place, with most of that wet air sitting just off the coastal sections there. Let's see if we can get to tomorrow's map. The magic clicker is not wanting to work its magic. There we go. It's not going to happen. We might be talking about tonight. Look at that. Showers and storms poking up across the Yukon Valley as we get into Monday afternoon. A few pockets of shower activity on the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. A scattering of storms all the way out toward the west coast, maybe closing in on Noatak and Kobuk Valleys, maybe the Seward Peninsula. A bulk of what you'll see south of the Yukon, though, is going to be more steady rainfall, and some of that could be heavy at times, thus the flash flood watch. A few showers further south and low pressure draped across the Gulf of Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula, still creating unsettled weather all the way out toward St. Paul. Some pockets of fog there. Light rain redevelops across parts of southeast, and warm air is spreading in across the North Pacific there. Here's Tuesday's map now, and showers and storms across the interior will still be possible. Some of those will contain possibly some moderate to heavy rainfall. A look for showers to continue around the Gulf Coast. Light rain across southwest, and coastal areas will be considerably cooler as a result. But if there is no cloud cover, or at least a little bit of cloud cover, temperatures are going to be up there, probably upper 70s and lower 80s for the Kuskokwim Valley and the Yukon Valley, the Copper River Basin, and parts of South Central. And we'll be watching for that heat into the midweek for conditions along the Matanuska River to bring up that river level a little bit more on top of the recent rainfall that we've seen. For southeast, light rain continues for you. A trough of low pressure just offshore will help to keep some of that air stirred up across your region. Look for winds to remain relatively light throughout the period, though, if you're heading out to sea. All right, as we move ahead in time to temperatures tonight, I'm going to need a little bit more help from the Magic Control Room. There we go. Here's the current temps across the region. Back in the mid-60s across most of southeast, 59 in Yakutat, mid to upper 50s around Prince William Sound, 60s for the Kenai Peninsula, just shy of 60 for Kodiak Island. And then there's the heat. Hard to miss, right? 70s and 80s across the interior from Fairbanks to McGrath to Ruby to Galena, all the way northward toward Fort Yukon, Tanana, and it looks like Eagle. All in the upper 70s and lower 80s today. Northway didn't make it, 68 degrees. Why? Well, a little bit more rain in that area. Copper River Basin generally in the lower 60s today. Here's a look up north. And you'll notice temps across the Arctic coast in the 30s, 40s, and even 50s there for Atkasuka. It's after you get away from the coast. 70s along the Brooks Range, Kotzebue Sound in the 50s and 60s. Kivalina 68, Nome was 61. The YK back in the 50s and 60s there. Unalakleet 67. Bethel a milder 72, and a little bit further out toward the Aleutians, 50s and 60s there. 46 at Attu, while St. Paul and St. George were about 50 degrees. Now, temperatures tonight as we look into the overnight lows, probably talking about readings in the mid to upper 50s for most of the interior to about 60 degrees. The Arctic coast, 30s and 40s there. Southeast, 40s and 50s. South Central, Prince William Sound, probably in the upper 40s at the coolest to the mid 50s at some of the warmest in the Susitna Valley and around Matsu. 53 around Kodiak Island and closer to 50 degrees for the Chain, the Alaska Peninsula, the YK, and the Pribilofs around 44. Now take a look at high temperatures tomorrow. You'll notice that readings are a little bit cooler for more areas in the southern third of the state. Probably talking about mid to upper 60s at best, lower 60s for southeast, upper 50s for parts of the Chain. And as you get out toward Adak and Atka, it's going to be a lot closer to 50 degrees. It looks like Fairbanks about 75. Anchorage in the mid-60s, Bethel 61, Nome 75, and Barrow closer to 51 with Juneau at 64. On to flying weather now. You'll notice the flying weather conditions aren't really changing that much. We still have an opportunity for storms across the interior, IFR across the Arctic coast, the Bering Sea, and the central and western chain with MVFR conditions across parts of the north and western Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, the coastal sections of the YK, and maybe Kotzebue Sound and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula. Let's check your pass conditions here. We'll zip right through these. Anaktuvuk Pass, VFR conditions there. Same goes for Adigan Pass tomorrow. We expect maybe a few storms on the south-facing slopes onto the Alaska Range, and Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should be just fine with VFR conditions there. You'll notice Rainy Pass and Windy Pass should be just fine. VFR conditions should prevail. Going around a little bit more to Isabel Pass, visual flight rule continues there, and smooth sailing and good flying weather for Mentasta Pass. As you look out toward Tanita Pass, things look just fine with VFR conditions prevailing. Portage Pass should be okay, but watch for MVFR on the eastern side. And last but not least, Chilkoot and White Pass also expected to be VFR. Here's your freezing levels, and you'll notice that warm weather right across the interior. No doubt it's going to be hot again with readings up to 10,000 feet there. The cold pocket out across the central Bering Sea as low as 6,000 feet. So pretty much status quo from what we were talking about yesterday. What about icing potential? Well, you would expect that with some thunderstorms, you could have isolated severe icing near thunderstorms, so you want to avoid that if you see those towers blossoming. There might be a pocket also across the middle of Yukon around 12,000 feet, out across the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, above 8,000 but below 14,000 for some light to isolated moderate, and maybe some patches of icing potential out across the Gulf, maybe just grazing Sitka, above 9 but below 13,000 feet. Let's look at the overall flow of the jet stream, that huge predominant trough stretching all the way from the eastern part of Siberia into the Pacific Northwest where high pressure is ridging here. And it's also trying to stretch its way all the way up into the Gulf or into the interior of Alaska, and doing a pretty good job there. But it's the weather that's slipping underneath that's keeping things stirred up and keeping that wet weather traveling into the central and eastern interior and keeping the south and southwestern parts and southeast pretty wet at this time. 9,000 feet now. You see very few changes from what we were talking about yesterday. Light winds across the interior, a southeasterly flow across southwestern Alaska, and low pressure stretching from the Bering to the western part of the Gulf with high pressure ridging up across British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, guiding in more of a southerly flow. At 3,000 feet, low pressure is a little bit shifted to the east across the YK, across the Alaska Peninsula, guiding in that southerly flow, which of course is wet coming off the ocean. More of a south flow working its way into southeastern Alaska, 20 to 25 knots there, and an easterly wind coming across the Brooks Range, about 5 to 10 knots, with the Aleutians looking at a westerly flow. Here's a look at the turbulence then as we wrap up our aviation report. There might be some chop across the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula below 4,000 feet, stretching very close to Kodiak Island, through the Bering Strait below 3,000 feet, and southeast you're looking pretty good for tomorrow. Remember, isolated thunderstorms could produce severe turbulence there, very close to thunderstorm towers and out and away with any gust fronts. So watch for that to develop tomorrow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with marine weather here in just a few minutes.
10 to 10 cars, COL, possible OUIL. Westbound Hall, approaching Groesbeck. Light brown Pontiac, fleet of Sam 497, all over the roadway. Comes back to an 87 Pontiac out of Clinton Township.
K9 1, testing 10, 151. 310. Where was that vehicle coming from? We're 21 and north right now.
Westbound Hall, approaching Groesbeck.
Is there a problem, officer?
Sir, do you know how fast you were going back there?
Oh, not exactly. Around 60, 70 knots.
Okay, well, I clocked you at 70 knots in a 60-knot zone. That's more than 1.5 times stalling speed.
Gee, I didn't realize I was going that fast.
Do you know how much of the runway you used?
Oh, half, maybe 2/3.
Also, it looked like you were weaving coming down the center line on your final approach.
Well, I guess it was a little bit more crosswind than what I thought.
Do you know what the crosswind velocity of this airplane is?
About 12 knots.
About 12 knots. All right. Well, sir, it says here that you've been cited for excessive speed on rotation, improper trim on takeoff, and failure to comply with noise abatement procedures.
Oh, they dropped the noise abatement charges.
All right. Well, sir, what I'd like you to do is go ahead, tilt your head back, touch your fingertips to your nose, and tell me what VASI stands for.
Visual Airborne Systems Information.
Well, that's a nice try. That's 1 out of 4. You know what this means.
You're going to give me a ticket?
Yes, I am. It's going to be to a takeoff and landing clinic. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Imagine if there really were runway police. Hi, I'm Harry Chase, and I can sure remember a landing or two that could have gotten me pulled over. And what about takeoffs? We often overlook them when talk turns to the challenges of aviation. After all, it's hard to collide with the sky, right? We assume as long as we're leaving the ground instead of returning to it that there's nothing to worry about. But accident data and incident reports say otherwise. 1 out of every 5 aviation accidents occurred during takeoff. The fact is, both takeoffs and landings continue to humble expert pilots and novices alike, and provide material for hours of hangar talk about technique and theory. And during a recent 10-year period, virtually half of all aviation accidents occurred during these 2 brief phases of flight. The better prepared you are, the less chance you'll appear in an accident statistic column. And that's why the Air Safety Foundation created this presentation on takeoffs and landings, the ups and downs of general aviation. Now, takeoffs and landings are part art and part science. The science comes from the physical laws that govern flight, the physics of lift, drag, and thrust, and meteorological phenomena, winds and updrafts and downdrafts that affect an aircraft. The art comes in the ability to use the experience, knowledge, and feel to adjust for the shifting conditions that make every landing and every takeoff unique. What about you? How prepared are you for aviation's ups and downs? When's the last time you really practiced takeoffs and landings? And when's the last time you practiced in less than ideal wind conditions? What performance parameters do you monitor when you practice them? What is the strongest crosswind you're comfortable landing in? And is it really that cross? Sometimes, after you do the calculation, a 15-knot wind turns out to have only a 6-knot crosswind component. How much do you really know about the takeoff and landing performance of the plane you fly? You have to judge your own answers to the questions. There is no runway traffic cop. It's up to each of us to maintain our proficiency and operate safely. Let's face it, some runways and weather conditions are harder to deal with than others. If your home field has a 5,000-foot runway and the wind never blows, you've reduced the odds of getting into trouble at either end of the flight. But we all use more than one airport, and they all have challenging winds from time to time. No airplane is immune to problems that could create an emergency on takeoff or landing. But surprisingly, the majority of takeoffs and landing accidents aren't caused by wind, weather, density, altitude, or runway length. They're usually due to lack of basic pilot skill, loss of control during these common but critical phases of flight. So, as pilots, we can't take any takeoff or landing for granted. At the same time, we have to be ready to manage the extra challenges encountered at many airports when getting on or off the ground. Obstructions, short fields, soft fields, wind gusts, crosswinds, hot days that effectively shrink the runway length we have to work with. Night operations that rob us of visual clues, or having the sun directly in our eyes at sunrise or sunset. We have techniques and procedures for dealing with all of these situations. Is it our training or a lack of exposure that accounts for the fact that only a small percentage of takeoff and landing accidents result from these adverse conditions? So, what about a normal takeoff and landing? You know, another windless day at the airport with the 5,000 feet of pavement. What do we need to consider in a situation like that? Okay, you're ready to take the active runway. There's no wind, no obstructions. You've got lots of pavement to work with, standard temperature and humidity, so what's there to think about? Let's start with the runway. Length is only one of the issues. If there's no wind and the field is non-towered, how do you select which direction to take off in? Would you base it on the direction you were flying, or think about what's lying off the departure ends, in case you have to put it on the ground after takeoff? Is there a slope to the runway? That will affect takeoff performance. Some runways are so sloped that pilots always take off downhill regardless of wind conditions. At other airports, you may have to decide if downhill with the wind is safer than uphill into the wind. Are there any rough spots in the runway you can avoid by favoring one side or the other? What about the runway condition? How's the braking action? Has it rained recently? Making it slick? If you have to stop your takeoff roll, that will become a factor. Runway surface condition is a factor cited in an impressive number of takeoff and landing accidents. What about the performance of the plane you're flying? What's the ideal rotation speed? And how do you know when you've reached it? So, as we can see, even a normal takeoff has several factors to take into account. And if you don't have these basics down for a normal takeoff or landing, you won't have the foundation to handle more complex and challenging situations.
Here's a look at your marine forecast now as we get the week started. Look for light southerly winds in the Lynn Canal, more of a northeasterly breeze across the Frederick Sound and Stevens Passage region, about 15 knots there. More of a southeasterly wind across southern areas, and coastal winds looking at south and southeasterly flow. Some of that more offshore the farther north you go, around 10 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas from Elfin Cove, especially up toward Yakutat. And then for Tuesday, a south and southeasterly wind continues, taking over really all areas. Now winds remain pretty light, 10 to 15 knots, with 2 to 3 foot seas on the inside and 4 to 5 foot seas along coastal areas in southeast on Tuesday. And then as we look at south central, as we get into Monday there, you'll notice more of an easterly flow inside Prince William Sound. Southeasterlies outside of the Sound, 20 knots or so, 6 to 7 foot seas across the western Gulf, and easterly flow onto Kodiak Island at 15 knots. Northeasterlies coming down the Cook Inlet. Until you get to the Barren Islands, that becomes more easterly and up to 20 knots there. Otherwise, 2 to 3 foot seas inside Cook Inlet, 5 foot seas west of the Barren, 6 foot seas on the eastern side, and 4 to 5 foot seas on either side of Kodiak Island there on Monday. As we look at Tuesday, you'll notice wind speeds there remain a little bit on the high side. Let's see if we can advance to the next map there. So there we are. Winds remain a little bit more variable with time and slowly subside and diminish as we get into Tuesday afternoon after staying up probably through a good part of Monday. An easterly flow inside of Prince William Sound, and things remain pretty variable there throughout the day. For Monday, across the Alaska Peninsula, a north and easterly wind inside of Bristol Bay, 2 foot seas there, 4 foot seas on the Pacific side, and a variable flow north of Cold Bay with 2 foot seas. By Tuesday, we should see wind speeds remain about the same there, with more of a southeasterly flow inside of Bristol Bay. Variable winds on the Bering side, but on the Pacific side, a little different story with southwesterlies coming in across the Alaska Peninsula and southward, 4 to 5 foot seas there. Now in the Aleutians, under the effects of high pressure, expect a variable wind pretty much for Monday and Tuesday combined. 2 foot seas on the north side, 3 foot seas on the south side, and we'll have a little bit more of a northeasterly steady wind at 15 knots way out around Attu. For Tuesday, though, you'll see similar conditions there. Very little change as we get into Tuesday afternoon, with one exception, south of Unalaska, a westerly flow there at 15 knots with 3 foot seas. Up to the west coast now, and north of Nunivak Island, winds will be coming out of the north 15 to 25 knots. A little bit more of a breeze there, 3 to 5 foot seas as a result, otherwise light and variable winds on Monday. For Tuesday, the flow reverses course a little bit, and you'll see more of a south and westerly flow out around St. Matthew, a southeasterly flow coming up the YK Delta and across Nunivak Island, southerlies crossing St. Lawrence Island at 20 knots, and we'll keep our variable flow around the Pribilofs. Up across the Arctic coast, we'll see more of a northeasterly wind coming in, 10 to 15 knots there from Kaktovik to Barrow, 3 foot seas north of Kaktovik, and northeasterlies picking up from Point Ley to Cape Lisburn inside Kotzebue Sound, 20 to 30 knots with 6 foot seas west of Cape Lisburn. For Tuesday, the conditions will continue to be a little blustery there across the Chukchi Seacoast with winds up to 30 knots, and easterly flow 15 to 20 knots around the Beaufort Seacoast to Barrow, and southwesterlies inside of Kotzebue Sound. Let's review our surface weather for the next couple days. High pressure is not enough to squash all of the rain chances across the Gulf or the coastal areas. Light rain will be possible across south central, but especially further north, and that's where the concern is, with flash flood watches across the Alaska Range toward the upper Kuskokwim Valley through Monday night. That'll be mainly on the north side there, and with that, we'll be watching for showers and storms across the Yukon Valley, north toward the Brooks Range and the south-facing slopes. That thunderstorm activity could stretch all the way out toward the Seward Peninsula. Showers are more likely across the western Alaska Range as we get into tomorrow afternoon. A light and steadier rainfall back across southeast, Kodiak Island, and the Alaska Peninsula, with showers developing across the Aleutians and high pressure trying to keep that at bay with areas of fog and stratus across most of the Bering Sea. As we move into Tuesday, you'll notice the showers and storms are still across the interior there, and the potential for some isolated but heavy rainfall is still generally north of the Alaska Range. So flash flood watches may be back if you're in the areas from the Alaska Range, including Denali National Park and Healy, eastward toward the eastern sections of the north-facing slopes of the Alaska Range and the upper Kuskokwim Valley. You want to stay tuned to this developing situation. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather, and have a great week.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.